The courtroom doors swung open. No one turned at first until a man stepped through. Light from the hallway poured in behind him, casting his silhouette in sharp relief. A tailored charcoal suit, silver hair, a gaze that silenced the room without a single word. The woman seated at the defendant's table looked up slowly. No one here knew. She was the wife of Supreme Court Justice David Carter, and she had no idea. This moment would change her life forever. Her name is Emily Carter, 32 years old, not a criminal, not a politician, just a simple woman caught in a storm she never asked for. But to reach this moment, what had she already lost? Emily Carter never looked like someone who'd stand in a courtroom. Each morning she walked 6 blocks through worn-out sidewalks to unlock the doors of Maple Street Community Center, a place held together by chipped paint, donated books, and laughter echoing down dusty halls. She wasn't paid much, often not at all, but that didn't stop her from fixing broken windows, tutoring after hours, or spending her weekends writing grant proposals. No one answered. The children called her Miss Emily, and their parents knew her name before they ever met her. There was nothing extraordinary about her clothes, no expensive jewelry, no headline-worthy story. Just a woman who believed every child deserved a safe place to dream. But something had shifted this year, and the center that once felt like home was suddenly standing in someone's way. What happens? When kindness becomes a threat, it started with a letter. Folded, once slipped under the center's front door, no envelope, no return address. Notice of redevelopment. A new commercial complex was planned, right where the center stood. Emily read it 3 times, seated alone at her small metal desk surrounded by crayon drawings and secondhand furniture. It wasn't official yet, just a proposal, but it felt like a warning. She called the city office. No answers. She emailed 3 departments. Auto replies. Still, Emily believed this was a misunderstanding. Surely they wouldn't take away the only safe place hundreds of children had. She placed the letter in her old leather notebook, the one where she kept every thank you card, every name, every memory. But deep down, a quiet question echoed in her mind. Who decides what deserves to stay and what gets erased? Emily didn't wait. The next morning she set up a folding table outside the center. A hand-painted sign read, "Help us protect what matters." She passed out flyers, explained the situation to every passerby, knocked on every door within 5 blocks. Not everyone signed the petition, but many did, parents, grandparents, former students who remembered what it meant to have somewhere to go after school. Each name went carefully into her leather notebook beside a short story, a connection. It wasn't just about saving a building. It was about saving a legacy built on trust and care. By the end of the week, she had over 200 signatures, enough to formally request historic designation for the center. She submitted the paperwork with trembling hands, hopeful but cautious. And somewhere beyond the paperwork, someone was watching. The city's response came in an email. No greeting, no thank you, just a single sentence. Your petition has been reviewed and denied. Emily read it 3 times. No reason given, no explanation. Just a flat rejection, like all those names, all those stories, didn't matter. She called the number listed. Straight to voicemail. She went to the planning office, only to be met with blank stares and quiet shrugs. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It felt like a door had been locked behind her. The redevelopment plans moved forward without pause. Fences were erected around the lot across the street. Emily stood outside City Hall, clutching her notebook in one hand and the denial email printed in the other. Something about this wasn't right. But how do you fight a system that won't even look you in the eye? Emily showed up to the city council meeting alone. She wore the same navy blue dress she wore to graduations and funerals, simple, respectful. Her leather notebook was tucked under her arm. When her name was called, she stepped to the microphone. Her voice wavered, but only at first. She spoke about the children, the families, the memories, about the scraped knees and art projects, the tutoring, the birthday cakes. The room was quiet. For a moment, she thought maybe she was getting through, until Councilman Gregory Vaughn leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, we've reviewed your appeal. The project is already approved. This center is not a landmark, it's an obstacle." The word stung. Obstacle. Emily stood a little straighter. "I'm not finished," she said quietly. The room shifted. For the first time, she saw who she was really up against. 3 days later, a thick envelope arrived at the center. It wasn't a petition response. It was a legal summons. Emily Carter was being charged with obstruction of justice and tampering with government documents. She sat at her desk, the children's laughter echoing just outside as she read the words over and over. According to the city attorney, the signatures she'd collected were fraudulent, and the historical documents she'd submitted were misleading and improperly filed. It didn't make sense. Every signature was real. Every file had been double-checked. But the charge was clear, and the message even clearer. Stop fighting, or we'll bury you. She took a breath, picked up her phone, and dialed the one person she hadn't called yet. But the voice on the other end said, "Justice Carter is in session. He'll return your call when available." That evening, the center was quiet. The kids had gone home. Paper drawings fluttered softly on the hallway walls, and the clock ticked like it was counting down. Emily stood in front of the community board, a faded cork wall pinned with schedules, thank you notes, and birthday party invitations. This place wasn't just a building, it was a memory still alive. She stared at the legal summons again. She could step away, let the development happen, let someone else fight. No shame in that. She was just one woman. But as she touched the worn edge of her notebook, a name slipped out, Jordan, age 7. "I feel safe here." Emily knew then, if she didn't fight for this place, no one would. She picked up a pen, signed the court acknowledgement form, and whispered to herself, "Let them come." The courthouse smelled like cold metal and polished stone. Emily had never been inside one before. She clutched her leather notebook as if it were a shield. The security guards barely looked at her. To them, she was just another name on the docket. Her attorney, Mark Ellis, court-appointed, was waiting outside the courtroom. Young, distracted, polite in the way people are when they don't expect to win. "We'll get through this," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Across the hallway, the city's legal team stood in a tight circle, pressed suits, shiny shoes, and quiet confidence. They didn't look worried. Emily looked down at her sneakers, then at the courtroom doors. She could still leave, but she didn't. She stepped inside, head high. The fight had begun, and she wasn't backing down. "All rise." The courtroom stood as Judge William Bradford entered, his black robe sweeping behind him like a shadow. Emily rose with them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide the shaking. She could feel every eye on her, the jury, the reporters, the legal aides, scribbling fast. "Case 914-B," the clerk announced. "The State versus Emily Carter." The judge adjusted his glasses and stared down at her from the bench. His expression was unreadable, but cold. "Ms. Carter," he said, "how do you plead?" Emily took a breath. "Not guilty." "Your Honor." The city attorney stood without pause. "Your Honor, the State requests that bail be denied. The defendant has already shown a disregard for lawful procedure." Her attorney fumbled for his notes, and in that moment, Emily saw it clearly. This courtroom wasn't built for people like her. The prosecutor, Peter Vaughn, stood with practiced ease. Tall, poised, and immaculately dressed, he looked more like a politician than a lawyer, maybe because he was both. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendant knowingly submitted fraudulent documents to delay a legal development project." He turned to the jury. "This case is not about passion, it's about process. Ms. Carter forged public records. That's not activism. That's a crime." Emily felt her pulse in her ears. Her attorney objected, but the judge waved it off. Peter continued. She collected signatures under false pretenses, lied to citizens, interfered with the lawful decisions of this city. None of it was true. But no one looked surprised. In fact, a few jurors nodded. Emily gripped her notebook beneath the table. Each word twisted her story into something unrecognizable, and worst of all, she wasn't sure anyone cared about the truth. The prosecution calls Monica Reynolds to the stand. Emily's breath caught. Monica, once a friendly face at City Hall, someone who used to drop off art supplies at the center, now walked to the witness box in a sharp blazer and quiet heels. Her eyes didn't meet Emily's. "Ms. Reynolds," Peter Vaughn began smoothly. "You're the assistant director of city planning." "Yes. Did the defendant ever pressure your office during the redevelopment process?" "She did," Monica replied. "Repeated emails, unverified claims, and community resistance that became disruptive." Emily leaned toward her attorney. "She's lying," she whispered. He gently tapped her arm to quiet her. The prosecutor continued. "Did she ever misrepresent the building's historical status?" "She submitted a petition, with signatures we later determined were invalid." Emily's voice stayed silent, but her heart screamed. "Is this what betrayal feels like?" Emily's attorney, Mark Ellis, stood slowly. His tie was crooked, his notes shuffled. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, voice unsure, "can you confirm whether you personally verified the signatures?" Monica tilted her head. "No. That was the city's legal team." "Then—" "You can't state they were invalid, correct?" Peter Vaughn stood. "Objection. Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Bradford said quickly. Mark tried again. "Isn't it true that the building had community significance for decades?" "Objection. Irrelevant." Sustained. Emily watched as every attempt to speak was crushed before it landed. Mark's voice grew softer. The jury grew restless. The judge barely looked up. She wanted to stand, to shout, to tell them who she really was. But the courtroom wasn't listening. They were building a version of her from paper, not truth. And for the first time, she began to wonder if justice was ever meant for people like her. During the brief recess, Emily sat alone at the defense table. Mark had stepped outside to take a call. Her hands rested on her notebook, but her mind spun in circles. Across the aisle, 2 court staff whispered near the wall. "She doesn't stand a chance," one said. The judge made up his mind before it started. "What do you mean?" the other asked. "Haven't you heard the developer funding this project? He's Bradford's brother-in-law." Emily froze. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out the rest of the room. She had suspected bias. But this was something else: corruption. This wasn't just a case, it was a performance, and the outcome had been decided before she ever walked through the door. She opened her notebook, tore out a blank page, and scribbled just 5 words. "You were right. He's compromised." Emily slid her phone under the table. With her fingers trembling, she typed quickly. "He's compromised. Developer equals judge's family. I need you." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. It was addressed to one person, David, her husband, her last hope. Just then, Judge Bradford's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Carter, what are you doing?" Emily froze. I was just bailiff," he barked. "Confiscate the phone. This is a courtroom, not a cafe." The officer approached. Emily hesitated, then handed it over. The message had been sent, maybe. Bradford stared down at her. "One more disruption," he said coldly, "and I'll hold you in contempt." Emily sat back, her hands empty, her voice taken. All she had now was the faint, flickering hope that David had seen her words in time. And outside those courtroom walls, the clock had just started ticking. The courtroom returned to session. Peter Vaughn wasted no time. One by one, more witnesses were called, each delivering testimony polished like rehearsed theater. A city planner spoke of procedural violations. A former intern claimed Emily pressured residents to sign things they didn't understand. Every sentence chipped away at her integrity like bricks pulled from a wall. Her lawyer's objections overruled. The judge uninterested. The jury watching her like they'd already decided. Emily's throat burned, but she said nothing. Her notebook now felt heavier than her entire body. This wasn't a case about facts anymore. It was about framing a story, and Emily wasn't the one telling it. For the first time, she realized. They weren't just trying to tear down her center, they were rewriting who she was. By 4:00 p.m., the courtroom lights felt harsher. Judge Bradford glanced at the clock, then at the stack of paperwork on his bench. To expedite proceedings, he said, "We'll continue into the evening session." Emily blinked. Her head throbbed. Her body ached. But no one asked if she could go on. The prosecutor's next witness was already walking to the stand, smiling slightly too rehearsed. Emily's attorney whispered, "He's trying to rush a verdict today." She already knew. The jury looked tired, bored even, as if her future was just another box to check before dinner. She looked around the room, this place that was supposed to hold justice, and felt like the only one still awake. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was an execution dressed in paperwork. The next witness took the stand, another city official, another piece in Vaughn's perfect puzzle. Emily had heard enough. She stood. "Your Honor," her voice cracked. "I request a recess. I need to consult with different counsel. My current representation is inadequate." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Judge Bradford's eyes locked on hers, sharp warning. "Miss Carter," he said coldly. "This is not the time for theatrics. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." Emily didn't sit. Her fists clenched. Her notebook pressed to her side like a lifeline. "I'm not trying to delay," she said. "I'm trying to survive." For a moment the room held still. Then the judge slammed his gavel. "Enough." Emily sat slowly, her body trembling, but something inside her had just woken up. The prosecution called their final witness. But before the person could reach the stand, the rear doors of the courtroom opened slowly, quietly. Everyone turned. A tall man stepped through, sharp suit, silver-streaked hair, measured stride, calm and certain. David Carter, Supreme Court Justice, Emily's husband. Gasps swept across the gallery. The jury whispered. The bailiff froze mid-step. Judge Bradford's jaw tightened. Peter Vaughn's expression cracked just for a second. David didn't break stride. He walked straight down the center aisle, gaze locked on his wife. Emily's heart thundered. Not just from relief, but from what his presence now represented. She wasn't alone anymore. And suddenly, this room didn't belong to them, it belonged to truth. Judge Bradford cleared his throat. "Proceedings will continue," he announced, but his voice lacked conviction. His gavel struck harder than needed, like he was trying to remind the room who was still in charge. But it didn't work. David Carter stepped to the front row. He paused, then addressed the bench with perfect calm. "Your Honor, I request permission to approach." Bradford's face went pale. "Justice Carter," he replied stiffly, "this is highly irregular." David's tone didn't change, and yet necessary, because this trial involves my wife. The courtroom gasped. Emily's eyes met his. 100 emotions passed in that glance: pain, love, gratitude, and something unspoken fight. Judge Bradford hesitated. The balance of power shifted quietly but unmistakably, and for the first time they looked nervous. David stepped beyond the barrier, and the bailiff, unsure what to do, opened the gate without being told. He approached Emily, leaned in briefly and whispered, "You did everything right." Her shoulders finally dropped just a little. Then he turned back to the bench. "Your Honor." David said evenly, "I request a 15-minute recess. I will require use of your chambers." Judge Bradford blinked. "This is highly unusual." David's expression didn't flinch. 15 minutes, not a second more. Silence gripped the room. Then finally, Bradford gave a terse nod. 15. Court is in recess. David extended a hand to Emily. She took it. As they walked together toward the judge's private door, Peter Vaughn stood offering a politician's smile and handshake. Justice Carter, an honor. David didn't take his hand. "Save it," he said. "You'll need it more than I will." And with that, the real trial was about to begin. Inside the judge's chambers, time felt heavier. The walls, once impressive, now seemed to close in. Judge Bradford stood behind his grand mahogany desk, the same desk he'd used to sign hundreds of rulings. But now it looked more like a shield. David remained standing. His presence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "William," he began, his tone razor-sharp yet calm. "Would you like to explain why my wife is being railroaded in your courtroom?" Bradford straightened his robe. "There's been no misconduct." "Spare me," David cut in. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a slim leather folder. He placed it on the desk between them like a sealed verdict. "This contains 3 things," he said. "Each one more damaging than the last." Bradford didn't reach for it, because he already knew what was inside. David opened the folder with deliberate precision. First, he said, pulling out a stamped envelope, certified documentation confirming the Maple Street Center's historical status, filed months before the demolition order. Bradford said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder. Second, David slid out a collection of affidavits testimonies from 7 residents confirming Emily's signature campaign was conducted ethically and with full transparency. Still no response. Third, he paused, then placed the final sheet between them. "Financial records tracing Meridian Development to your brother-in-law's holding company through 3 shell entities." Silence. Bradford's face drained of color. His mouth opened slightly, but no words followed. David leaned in. "You may have fooled this courtroom," he said softly, "but you didn't fool me. Or the Judicial Ethics Committee they've been watching." The judge's knuckles turned white on the edge of the desk, and for the first time, he looked small. The door creaked open. Peter Vaughn stepped into the judge's chamber, smile already forming. "I thought we might discuss a resolution," he said, eyes flicking between the 2 men. David didn't turn. He simply gestured toward the document still lying on the desk. "You're just in time," he said. "We were reviewing a pattern of prosecutorial misconduct." Vaughn's smile faltered. "Excuse me," David finally faced him. 3 weeks ago, your office received an email from the city archives confirming the authenticity of the landmark petition." Vaughn blinked. "That's not, it was never forwarded to the defense," David cut in. "That email has already been sent to the State Bar's Ethics Committee." Bradford sat defeated. Vaughn remained standing frozen between denial and collapse. And now both men realized they hadn't just picked the wrong woman. They'd picked the wrong husband. David looked from Bradford to Vaughn, then back again. Calm, controlled, certain. "Here's what happens next," he said. "Judge Bradford, you will recuse yourself immediately, citing an undisclosed conflict of interest." He turned. "Mr. Vaughn, you will file a motion to dismiss all charges against my wife with prejudice." Neither man moved. "If you don't," David continued, "this folder goes to the Chief Justice before sunrise. And this case becomes national news, a televised scandal of corruption, bias, and ethics violations." Bradford's mouth opened, then closed again. Vaughn reached for his tie, loosening it for the first time all day. "You have until the end of recess," David said. "But I'd suggest you act now, because whether you choose to walk out with your titles or your disgrace, Emily walks out free. That's not up for negotiation." The room stayed silent, and then they nodded. The door to the judge's chambers opened. David stepped out first, shoulders straight, gaze steady. Emily followed, her notebook still clutched in both hands. But now her steps no longer trembled. The courtroom, once buzzing with whispers and certainty, had fallen into a stunned hush. Reporters stopped typing. Jurors leaned forward uncertain. Even the bailiff stood a little taller, sensing the shift. No one said a word. No orders were shouted. But something in the way David held Emily's hand made it clear the tide had turned. They didn't return to the defense table. They walked straight toward the exit doors side by side. Every footstep echoed louder than any gavel. And as they passed the gallery, even those who once doubted her now made space. The verdict hadn't been spoken, but the room already knew how it would end. Judge Bradford re-entered the courtroom moments later. But something had changed. His black robe no longer carried weight, it hung from his shoulders like a burden too heavy to bear. He didn't look at Emily, or David, or anyone really. He took his seat slowly, eyes fixed on the desk before him. This court, he began, voice dry and stripped of authority, is adjourned. All charges against the defendant are dismissed with prejudice. The gavel fell. Once. No applause, no cheers. Just silence, thick still and undeniable. Emily stood near the doors, hand still wrapped around her notebook. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for a brief second. Not in victory, but in relief that truth had finally spoken louder than power. Emily and David stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The late afternoon sun painted gold across the stone facade. Reporters waited at a distance, too stunned, too respectful to shout. Emily paused at the top step, her hand still in David's. For a moment she looked back not at the courtroom but at everything it represented. Doubt, fear, silence, and survival. Her notebook rested at her side, pages curled slightly from her grip, but she no longer held it like armor. David looked over, his voice low. "You okay?" She nodded, but inside something had shifted. She had walked into that courtroom as the accused. She was leaving it not as a victim, but as a woman who refused to be erased. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet strength whispered, "This is not the end." That evening, the house smelled like chamomile tea and something warm baking. Emily sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the wood, watching the sunlight bleed across the counter tiles. David moved about quietly, jacket, gone, sleeves, rolled tie, loosened. He looked less like a justice and more like the man who once read legal briefs to her under a blanket on the couch. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said finally. David looked over. "I didn't want to use your name, your position. I just wanted the center to stand on its own." He sat across from her, reaching for her hand. "And it will," he said. "But sometimes even truth needs a witness." Emily smiled faintly, but her eyes still held questions. She had won. But why did it still feel like something had been lost? The kitchen grew quieter as the sun dipped below the trees. Emily turned her gaze toward the window. "I kept thinking," she whispered, "if I had just fought harder, maybe I wouldn't have needed you." David shook his head. "No," he said gently. "This wasn't about needing me. This was about exposing a system designed to bury the truth." He leaned in, voice steady. "You fought the right way, Emily. Petitions, community, legal channels. They were the ones who broke the rules, not you." His words didn't erase the ache, but they softened it. She looked at him then, eyes glassy but strong. "You think justice was served today?" David hesitated, then smiled, tired wise. "No, justice wasn't served in that courtroom." He squeezed her hand. "It was in you when you refused to back down." And in that moment, Emily finally believed it too. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the Maple Street Community Center. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the first light painted soft amber across the sidewalk. She carried her leather notebook, creased at the corners, pages full, tighter than ever. Not as a shield, but as a promise. The redevelopment notice had been torn down. In its place, she pinned a new sign, "Open today. All are welcome." Inside chairs still sat askew from last week's reading group. Crayons waited in jars, and somewhere a child's forgotten sweater hung over the back of a tiny plastic chair. Emily took a deep breath. Today wasn't about winning. It was about continuing. And, as she unlocked the door, she realized this right here was the kind of justice no courtroom could ever grant. By mid-morning, the center was no longer quiet. Children ran down the hallways barefoot, laughing, calling her name. "Miss Emily." One girl hugged her around the waist without warning. "You came back," she squealed. "I never left," Emily smiled. In the art room, markers uncapped themselves, paper filled with suns, hearts, and crooked houses. A group of teens set up chairs for storytelling hour without being asked. Parents came in, to some with casseroles, others with tears. A man she barely knew pressed an envelope into her hand. "Just a little help," he said. "From a few of us." She didn't open it right away. She didn't have to. The gesture said more than words ever could, and as she turned to hang another child's drawing on the wall, a small, folded card fell out from her notebook. She hadn't written it. Emily unfolded the small card. The paper was soft, aged at the corners, the handwriting careful, slightly slanted, as if written slowly, with intention. It read, "You didn't just protect a building. You protected childhood memories, safe places, second chances. You gave dignity to people who never thought they deserved it. This community didn't forget. We never will. No signature, no return address, just a final line at the bottom. We stand because you stood first." Emily's throat tightened. She held the card to her chest, eyes closing just for a moment. It wasn't an award. It wasn't a press headline, but it was everything she ever wanted to hear. And yet, this wasn't the last surprise waiting for her that day. Later that afternoon, as Emily tidied the front desk, a young boy walked in, barely 10. He held out a small wooden box painted unevenly with bright colors. "For you," he said shyly. Inside was a single bronze key tied with a red ribbon. Underneath it, a folded note in crayon. "This key opens the room where my brother stopped crying, where my mom smiled again, where I learned to read. You kept the door open, so now it's yours." Emily's hands trembled. It wasn't about the key. It was what it unlocked: trust, belonging, memory. She looked down at the boy whose smile held no agenda, just truth. And in that instant, Emily understood. This center wasn't saved by legal rulings. It was saved by love returned. That evening, long after the last child had gone home, Emily sat alone in the quiet office of the center. The little wooden box now rested in the top drawer of her desk, placed gently like something sacred. She picked up the bronze key, turned it slowly in her fingers, watching how the lamplight danced along its edges. Not a key to a room, not even to a building, but to a belief that small kindnesses echo, that standing firm matters, that someone always remembers. She opened her leather notebook not to defend herself, not to prove anything, but to begin writing again. This time, not signatures, just names, stories, memories, wins, a new page. She wrote at the top in bold, simple letters, "Day 1. We begin again." The next morning, Emily stood with David at the train station. His suitcase rested by his feet. A familiar weight returned to his shoulders, briefcase in one hand, purpose in the other. Neither of them said much. They didn't have to. She looked up at him, sunlight catching the silver in his hair. "You sure you're ready for DC again?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Are you sure you're ready for Maple Street again?" They both knew the answer. David kissed her forehead, then boarded the train. From the window he raised 2 fingers. Peace, strength, and something only the two of them understood. Emily watched until the train disappeared. She turned and walked away, not heavy, not broken, but steady. Different battlegrounds, same war, and now they were both armed with truth. That Friday afternoon, Emily sat cross-legged on the library rug surrounded by kids. The lights were warm. The walls were lined with drawings, some new, some yellowed with time. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked. Dozens of little heads nodded. She didn't tell them about courtrooms or judges or legal threats. She told them about a Kia door and someone who refused to let it be locked forever. Her voice was gentle but firm, the kind of voice that stays with you years later when you're standing at your own closed door. One girl raised her hand. "Miss Emily, was that someone you—" Emily paused, then smiled. "It could be," she said, "but maybe one day it'll be you." And in a quiet corner of the room, a boy began writing in a little notebook just like hers. The story didn't end at Maple Street. A week later, the local paper ran a front-page article, "Simple Woman, Unshakable Stand." Emily's photo, taken candidly as she unlocked the center's door, appeared beneath the headline. Hair slightly windblown, smile soft, eyes tired but alive. Soon after, blogs picked it up, then regional news, then a quiet segment on national television. People weren't drawn to drama, they were drawn to dignity. Donations began to arrive, small handwritten envelopes, sometimes just a few dollars, accompanied by notes like, "You reminded me what integrity looks like. Thank you for not giving up." Emily kept the letters in a shoebox under her desk. She never answered interviews. She never spoke at rallies. But somehow, her silence spoke louder than most speeches ever could. One afternoon, while restocking books in the reading room, Emily looked up and froze. Monica Reynolds stood in the doorway. The same Monica who once testified against her. The same Monica who hadn't made eye contact since. She held a donation box, hands trembling slightly. "I heard. You could use some new shelves," she said. Emily didn't respond at first. Then she stepped forward and hugged her. No words, no blame, just quiet understanding. Later that week another came, then another. Former skeptics, former critics. They didn't say sorry with speeches. They said it with presence. That night, Emily opened her notebook one last time. She turned to a fresh page and wrote, "It doesn't take everyone to believe in you, just enough to remind you not to stop." And now, only one page remained. That night, as the center lights dimmed and the city quieted outside, Emily sat alone in her office. The notebook opened, the bronze key resting beside it. She turned to the final page. There were no signatures to collect, no arguments to defend, just space. She picked up her pen and wrote slowly, "Justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears sneakers, carries a box of crayons, or opens a door that someone else tried to close." She smiled, gently closed the notebook and placed the key inside. Then she locked her office, stepped into the cool night and walked home, head high, shoulders soft, heart full. Not famous, not flawless, just a simple woman who stood her ground. And because she did, the ground held. If this story touched something in you, share it. Because sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to sit down.